Good morning. In normal circumstances, we'd be in the hall now, and we'd have an assembly probably based around remembering the 274 Latimerians here on this stone in the memorial tablet, reflecting on the loss that the school suffered in World War I and widening that out to the country's and the world's losses. Well, we can't meet in the main hall, and we can't because we're in a pandemic. And of course, in 1918 and 1919, the world was in an even worse pandemic, the so-called Spanish flu, that probably claimed something like 90 million to 100 million lives. 225,000 of those were in this country. And we're beginning to understand that quite a few of the names, indeed, on that stone were actually not the victims traditionally of bullets and bombs, but they were also victims of the Spanish flu. Around about 2.5% of people that caught the Spanish flu in 1918, 1919 died of it. And it was particularly vicious indeed for people in their 20s and their 30s. So why was it so lethal, and why was the world far less well equipped to deal with it than we are now with COVID? The main reason, of course, is that the world was in the grip of a terrible, terrible conflict. The orders were that armies just had to keep fighting, that ships had to keep sailing, that factories had to keep running. Here are the Canary Girls, so called because they turned yellow, putting the chemicals in these fuses. They weren't shut down, they had to come into work. And so these photos of soldiers in military hospitals are not the victims of gunshot wounds or bombs, but the victims of this flu epidemic that broke out around about July 1918 in England, but almost certainly came from troops arriving from America in the summer of 1918. The order was, though, to keep fighting, not to mention it, not to report it in the press, indeed not to mention it in public places as much as possible. The only real evidence about the Spanish flu in local newspapers in West London is adverts as to how to deal with it. It was regarded as something that must be happening elsewhere. And only Spain wasn't fighting in World War I, only Spain really reported it openly in the summer of 1918. The King of Spain caught it. And this was quite useful to everyone else fighting, the French, the Germans, the British newspapers and governments, because they could say that there was an influenza that started in Spain and was contained to Spain.
Corporal Stewart. How the men doing? How's morale down at the front?
To be quite honest, sir, not very well, sir.
Not very well? What do you mean, not very well?
Falling like flies, sir.
Falling like flies? It's not the syphilis again. The French disease.
No, sir, it's the flu, sir. Terrible, sir.
The flu? Is it a British trench? There is no flu in the British trenches. Do you understand me, Stuart?
Yes, sir. Sorry, sir. It's a Spanish disease. I mean, it's the unflu.
That's better, Stuart. I like that. The Hun flu. Here. I'm a baby wipe.
Oh, thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, have you got a face covering?
Oh, sorry, sir.
So in Britain, there was no Ministry of Health. That was to happen a year later. It was down to localities to deal with it in the way that they could. And this advert in a local newspaper demonstrates quite a lot of ignorance about how to deal with it. This one says a cupful of OXO 2 or 3 times a day will do the job. Stop spitting. But very few people wore face masks, and everything virtually was running as normal in Hammersmith, as much as we know. This is a photo of clearly here soldiers behind the lines taking some kind of remedy, but this is a photo of Hammersmith in the summer of 1918, and everything was running pretty much as normal. Cinemas were open, local factories were open, and indeed Latimer was open. And we know a little bit about how the school responded to the epidemic by reading the Latimerian. It has in its pages, we have a school photo here of Latimerians. You can see many of the boys here are in military uniform, the expectation being that indeed they would be preparing to go to the front. And here is the headmaster, the Reverend C.J. Smith. That's his bust on the left side of the main hall as you look at the stage. And C.J. Smith essentially kept the school running as normal. There's very little hint in the Latimerian of the day that indeed things were different. There's a reference in November the debating society couldn't meet because there was a lot of illness around. But very, very sadly, there are some clues that the Spanish flu, which is obviously a function of the war, it's a consequence of troops moving around and the early contractions happening because of the concentrations of troops, in fact, in trenches and factory workers in factories and so on. There's this sadness that it had an impact on civilian life at home as well. And this is a pupil called T.F. Hinton. It said, held a scholarship since September 1916. And this is what the Latimerian records. He was an excellent pupil in work and conduct and made rapid progress from Form 3B at admission to his promotion to Form 6B in September last. He left school during Friday, October the 11th. That's just a month before Armistice Day, feeling ill, and he was found to be suffering from influenza and later pneumonia supervened. On October the 23rd, he died, and his sister succumbed to the same felt disease the same day. We also now know that the only teacher on the memorial stone, this is Percy Brill. He was a Latin teacher. He was on service in India, and India was particularly badly hit by the Spanish flu. We think something like 20 million Indians died in 1918 and 1919. Well, he died aged 37 as a sergeant, and because of the pandemic, we've looked rather closely at his record, and it transpires that, in fact, he died from pneumonia, which was brought on by, well, here it says in the Latimerian, at the age of 37, pneumonia has carried him off, and we mourn the loss of a dear friend and a true patriot. Mr. Brill is the first member of the permanent staff of the Latimer Upper School who has died. He leaves a widow and 2 young boys. And he wasn't the only teacher. This is Mr. Fowler. I think he was a chemistry teacher who also died, and he wasn't serving. He was actually at school. And here it marks his passing as well. He was one of the original teachers when the school opened on its present site in the late 19th century. The boys, the pupils on the stone, there are many of them as well who we now know indeed were also victims of the Spanish flu. This is Phillips Kingsford. He was one of the greatest athletes the school has ever produced. He actually held the triple jump record, the English triple jump record. Here he is jumping. in 1911. He jumped 13 meters and 57. It was a new event, and he's regarded as one of the pioneers. Philip Kingsford, and he's on the stone there. He also died of the Spanish flu. Now we know, and not in combat. Although his brother did. His brother's name is on the right hand side of the stone, and he also passed away at the Battle of the Somme. And George Carter, who was a naval cadet at Dartmouth, we here have his record here, his death certificate. Died on the 29th of July 1918, and it says here influenza. So consequently, the Spanish flu had a major impact on Latimer as a community. Of course, wider impact on the country and indeed the whole world. And it's impossible to understand the Spanish flu without thinking of it as made immeasurably worse by the war. And therefore, I think it is worthy of our commemoration to think about the victims of the flu in 1918-19 as victims of war. And so with that thought, I'll leave you perhaps to your own thoughts. Perhaps you would like a minute or two to reflect on victims of war. Thank you.